what we eat is what provides the nutrients that help to support our immune system, that give us everything that our body needs to function. If you are eating a poor diet and you are experiencing deficiencies in various nutrients that your immune system needs to be able to function properly, then over time that can lead to a dysregulation of your immune system because it doesn't have what it needs to properly regulate itself. So the way it's attacking our tissues in an autoimmune disease sounds bad, but we want that to occur.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Dr. Joey Munoz Show, your go-to podcast for all things nutrition, health, and fitness. I'm your host, Dr. Joey, Nutrition Sciences Ph.D. and founder of Fit for Life Academy. I just finished recording a great episode with my good friend, Dr. Adrian Chavez, who's been on the podcast more than anybody else. I think this is probably the 4th or 5th episode. For those of you guys that don't know Dr. Adrian Chavez, he has his PhD in nutritional sciences, just like myself. And he really focuses on helping individuals who have mainly autoimmune and digestive conditions. And so in this episode, we took a deep dive on autoimmune disease. We talked about what autoimmune disease is in the first place, some of the common causes, diagnoses, as well as the relationship between autoimmune diseases, gut health, and diet. Hope you guys really enjoy this episode. It's a completely different topic that I haven't covered on the podcast at all. So I'm sure you're going to find it interesting and exciting. Hope you enjoy. Dr. Adrian Chavez, how are you doing today, my man?
I'm doing well. Glad to be on again.
Yeah, dude. I think this is what, 4th time? And I'm
I
always
think I lost count.
Awesome, dude. So we're going to talk about the relationship between nutrition and autoimmune disease, which is a really interesting topic. I say we just go ahead and jump into it. And I think the best way to start this is to define for the audience what is autoimmune disease or what is an autoimmune disease.
So yes, definitely. And this topic I think is really important to discuss. And I want to preface this by saying, like, I'm not a rheumatologist. I have a PhD in nutrition, just like Joey, and I've just worked with a lot of people in this field and have tried to read all of the research that I can in terms of this relationship between nutrition and autoimmune disease, because it's a really evolving topic. We don't know enough about it at this point, and the research is evolving a lot right now. And I've tried to stay as up to date as I possibly can. So in terms of defining autoimmune diseases, it's a collection of a variety of different diseases that are defined by our immune system essentially attacking our own cells. And so there's different diseases that fall under this classification. This affects about 1 in 8 to 1 in 10, or 1 in 12 to 1 in 10 adults in the United States. So it's about 1 in 8, 1 in 10 people, or what am I saying? 8 to 12%. It is what the estimates are, somewhere around there. And so it's a variety of different diseases. So there's, lupus, some people are familiar with that, multiple sclerosis. One of the most common ones is Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition. And all of these are the similarities. Arthritis is another one, rheumatoid arthritis. And the similarities here are that the immune system is attacking our own tissues. And it can happen for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about this throughout the episode, but that's what's going on. And so there's 80 different types of autoimmune diseases, and they're defined based on the types of tissues that are being attacked. And for, unfortunately, people, when we develop an autoimmune condition, we're much more likely to develop another because there's genetic components involved in just the way that our immune system works. And so, what's going on there is your immune system just starts to attack your own cells. And the way that I like to describe it, an analogy that I like to use, is our immune system is kind of like a police force, and it's going around trying to protect our body. So our immune system is just going around throughout our body, trying to identify potential harmful, what are called antigens. And sometimes that police force gets a little bit out of balance to where it starts to shoot good guys and starts to actually like cause destruction to the things that it's not supposed to. And that can happen for a variety of reasons, but that's kind of what an autoimmune disease is your police force in your body is kind of turning against your body and causing destruction against your body. And again, that can happen for a variety of reasons. And depending on the tissues that are being attacked, that's kind of what defines an autoimmune disease. So if it's your thyroid, it's Hashimoto's. If it's your spinal cord, it's multiple sclerosis. And like I said, there's like 70 to 80 different autoimmune diseases that are currently identified.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's essentially the immune system identifying things that are benign as harmful, right?
Yes, and unfortunately, we say this, identifying things as benign. That's not sometimes it's a little more complicated than that. So sometimes it's actually like there's a virus like in your cells kind of hiding out, and the immune system is trying to find that virus, and it's basically attacking your cells trying to find that virus, and that's the issue. So many people are familiar with this, and this has been the case, forever, but it's become more commonly like more common knowledge is some people will develop autoimmune conditions after developing COVID, and they'll have a systemic
Mhm.
immune response that leads to just an autoimmune development of an autoimmune condition or multiple autoimmune conditions after that. And that's always been the case with viral infections is we can Epstein-Barr virus is another one that's very commonly associated with autoimmune conditions. And there's other viruses as well that we can get exposed to a virus, and that kind of triggers our immune system to become more reactive.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it flows nicely into the next topic of like what really causes autoimmune disease.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely, I mentioned the viruses, genetic factor. So it's a combination of genetic and environmental factors. The genetic factors are really the that lay the groundwork. You have to have the genetics in order for the immune system to start to create those type of dysfunctional attacks against your own tissue. So, like for example, someone who has like rheumatoid arthritis, there's going to be certain genes that make them more likely that their immune system is going to be attacking those various tissues. And this is the case with all autoimmune conditions. There's a genetic background that occurs that makes someone more likely to have these types of responses. Now, beyond that, everything that happens in our life. So, our microbiome is really important for helping to establish our immune system, what's called like to establish like tolerance in our immune system. And so the development of our microbiome early in life seems to be a factor in autoimmune disease and the development of autoimmune disease. So whether or not you were birthed through, vaginal birth versus C-section, whether or not you were breastfed, how many antibiotics you took throughout your life, exposures to microbes in your environment. If you lived in an overly sterilized home, that can have a negative effect on your microbiome, which also has a negative effect on your immune system, makes you more likely to have allergies and other types of autoimmune type of reactions. So some of this is like early life stuff that we can't really change.
Mhm.
And then a lot of this is also just our lifestyle. If you're inactive, if you're highly stressed, if you're eating a poor diet, all of these things can lead to nutrient deficiencies. They can, like poor sleep, can lead to changes in the immune system that lead to it being more, leading to more inflammatory responses. Poor dietary habits can lead to nutritional deficiencies, low vitamin D, low vitamin A, low vitamin C, a variety of different nutrients that are important for immune function. And if you're, these habits, you have some of these early life events, you have some of these habits throughout your life, and you have some of these genetic influences, and then medications can often play a role as well. So let's say you're taking lots of antibiotics, lots of proton pump inhibitors, other types of medications also can influence autoimmune disease risk. But all of these things combined over the course of a lifetime can cause someone to start to develop these symptoms later on, and they typically don't happen very often in childhood. They tend to develop, in 20s and 30s for most people.
Yeah, the topic of like medication is really interesting, and it's not something I don't really know much about this at all. But anecdotally, it does seem that at least people that take a higher number of medications perhaps seem to have more symptoms related to like GI distress and stuff like that, which oftentimes are things that we don't even think about when we start taking medication for a particular health reason.
You know, I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but this is one of the reasons that I kind of understand this topic and know about it is like personally. So I played basketball in high school. I had knee pain, and my doctor was like, "Oh, take some non-steroid," or it was like ibuprofen, 800 milligrams of naproxen he just gave me to take that every day. I was like, "Oh, just take this and it'll be good." And it felt great. I had no idea what was going on though. I took it every single day for years. And then a couple years later, I started to develop some GI issues, some pain. Um, Went to a doctor. They gave me a bunch of antibiotics, proton pump inhibitors, made things worse. And at that point, that was when I first started to notice that I had some symptoms that I didn't think were normal. So like back then, I had GI issues, and I changed my diet and all that stuff improved over time. Stopped taking the medication because I started doing research on it. The first doctor never even asked me about it. And I was like, man, I've been taking this medication that literally breaks down your stomach lining and I have stomach issues.
Yeah.
Like this is what happens. So if anyone doesn't know, NSAIDs, they break down your stomach lining. And if you have a family history of stomach ulcers or anything like that, there's a high risk in taking them. And I have a strong family history of stomach ulcers. I have a great uncle that like died of a stomach ulcer. And so I was taking these medications for a couple of years and it caused some serious issues for me. And dietary changes helped. I significantly changed my diet and all of those symptoms went away. My digestive system improved. But I also took lots and lots and lots of antibiotics when I was a kid as well. So that probably also contributed to it. And then another thing that can contribute to autoimmune disease that I forgot to mention that I remembered because I was talking about my antibiotic use when I was a kid is environmental toxins. So like, for example, if you live in like a moldy home or you live in a very polluted city, that can just constantly trigger your immune system. And that when I mention like, your immune system's like your police force, well, the police force in a very crime-riddled neighborhood is gonna be more likely to cause damage to, pedestrians and that's just what's going on in some cases is your immune system is just under constant attack, sometimes from things that you don't realize, environmental pollutants. And this isn't super common. I personally lived in a extremely moldy home when I was a kid, and I was just sick all the time. And when I was in my early 20s, started to realize that my hands were like inflamed, just felt like in pain. And I thought I had arthritis at that time. And so that was like early symptoms of me kind of realizing like, I think I probably have some type of autoimmune type of condition. And so that was for me, like largely driven by medication use, probably some lifestyle stuff there as well, like sleep and drinking and other things. But the medication, when I stopped that and kind of changed my diet there, like, and I wasn't like drinking all the time or anything like that at that point, and I was eating a decent diet, but I wasn't. Um, I was just eating a really high protein bodybuilder type diet and like no veggies, kind of that type of approach, and shifting to a more plant based diet, much more nutritious, really really helped. And so yeah, medications play a big role, and it's important to understand sometimes like how that can be potentially influencing things, and definitely talk to your doctor before getting on things long term, and just making sure. And I don't want to scare anyone away from taking a medication that's going to be beneficial for your health, but at the end of the day, sometimes there are these side effects that we don't realize. And uh, I've worked with over 100 clients with autoimmune conditions. There are some cases where, medication use similar to what I just described in my life has seemed to be a influencing factor in the development of their condition. And it's usually like a story like mine where someone was on like multiple rounds of antibiotics to where it caused like GI issues, and then they started to develop more autoimmune type issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's important, like when you mention NSAIDs, uh, damaging stomach lining, it's all also dose dependent and how long you're taking it for too, right? Because as you mentioned, we don't want to scare people to not use these things because in certain contexts, they can be very helpful. I just think it's important for people to be aware of potential side effects and discuss those with their doctors and not be blind to the fact that everything in life can have pros and cons. Nothing is completely positive and nothing is, in most cases, completely negative. And it's important to weigh the pros and cons for your specific situation, right? Like you mentioned, you have a family history of stomach ulcers. High dose NSAID is probably not the best idea for you, but for somebody else, maybe not as dangerous. Maybe not taking it daily for years. That probably wasn't a good idea.
I mean, that's how I was prescribed it. It was just like, "Here, take it," and you just kept refilling my prescription, and never once was anyone discussed like, "Hey, there's some potential side effects with this." And I developed, like, sharp stomach pain that wouldn't go away, and I'm like, went to the doctor, this was months. Went to the doctor, and they just put me on, what's called antibiotic triple therapy for H. pylori. Like, he just basically assumed I had H. pylori. I don't recall them asking about my medication use even at that time. They just put me on like medication as if I had H. pylori, because H. pylori can cause stomach ulcers and those type of symptoms. And that wasn't the right approach. And it just made things much worse.
Yeah, that's pretty messed up.
Yeah, yeah. And so there was a while where I was like super anti-pharma. Like definitely like my early 20s, and kind of how I got into this field was like anti-pharma. Like nutrition
Yeah.
is a better approach than these options. But now, I realized, okay, there's utility to both.
Of
We just have to
course.
be skeptical and very, we have to be smart about the way that we approach each of these approaches, because you can approach nutrition in the same way where it actually causes damage as well.
Dude, my story time really quick. My aunt pretty much like self-medicates with all sorts of things all the time. And she's a type 2 diabetic. She's pretty much injects like high dose insulin all the time. And she's always sick, and she always has it's some random virus, and then she's always on some sort of antibiotic. Like always.
Mhm.
And goes from antibiotic treatment to next to next to next. And she's always complaining about like how she feels really, really bad. And never once does she think it's maybe like the self-medication.
Yeah.
She never once thinks it's like, oh, maybe it's all of these drugs that I'm taking all the time at high doses, not prescribed by a doctor. She owns a pharmacy. She has access to these things. So she just uses them at her discretion, which is not a smart thing to do at all. But she just like, thinks everything that she feels in terms of like feeling bad is related to some sort of viral infection. And she just uses antibiotics pretty much all the time. And she's been doing so for as long as I can remember, dude, probably over 15 years.
That's a
It's crazy.
Hispanic thing. My
Sorry?
That's a Hispanic thing. My stepdad does that too, and he doesn't own a pharmacy, but he goes to Mexico, has
Yeah.
antibiotics, and he uses them anytime he feels any degree of sickness.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are negative consequences to that. Our
Of course.
microbiome is important for our overall health, and uh, I've seen this because most of my clients have digestive or autoimmune conditions, and I've seen this over and over again where people have developed serious chronic health issues from overuse of antibiotics, and that's not ever going to come. Some people get afraid to take them at all when they hear some of these things. That doesn't happen from like taking them once. It happens from like when I was a kid, they used to always diagnose me with upper respiratory infection. I just was exposed to mold all the time and was just always sick from that. And so I took antibiotics 3 or 4 times a year, probably every single year minimum, like consistently. And so I definitely I had GI issues later on in my life. Of course I did. Like I was taking antibiotics for a while and then started taking, and this was my diet was terrible too, but the level of GI issues that I developed were largely driven by medication, because at that point my diet was a lot better once they really like started to get worse.
When it comes to autoimmune conditions, are there also like gender differences, age-related differences as well? Like Hashimoto seems to be much more prevalent in women, at least anecdotally. I haven't looked at the data here. Some of these seem to be developed more during menopause as well. Touch on that a little bit.
Pretty much all women. Yeah. So autoimmune disease is largely a gender biased, condition or group of conditions. So, 80 to 90% in general of autoimmune patients are women. Now it ranges based on the specific autoimmune disease, but I'm a guy and I have an autoimmune condition and I'm a guy. Like I am,
Yeah.
so it's not all women, but it's much more common in women. And it's, specifically certain autoimmune conditions, like Hashimoto's and other things like Hashimoto's strongly, you know, gender bias towards women. Now this is thought to be largely due to hormones, and differences in hormones, and then also differences in like the way that our immune systems work. But we don't really understand that well. Like in the research, there's not really great explanations as to why this is the case. The thinking is that it's probably hormones and just baseline differences in the way that our immune systems work based on our overall gender.
Yeah, dude, it is so hard to really fully understand this stuff just based off of the limitation of the nature of this type of research too, right? And this is something I've always thought about too. It's like, man, biology and biochemistry and all of these different mechanisms are really hard to understand because you can't ever see them all working together simultaneously like you would in a living human being, right? You test one mechanism, maybe two mechanisms in a petri dish, and then you try to piece stuff together. But if only there were a way to really like see the big picture of everything going on simultaneously, it's just impossible.
Yeah, one day we're gonna have some amazing screening tools. The challenge
Yeah.
there also with that is like you don't necessarily want to do like a long screening for antibodies for autoimmune conditions because many people will test positive for antibodies and not have any symptoms. And your immune system might be having some level of, some type of reaction to, let's say, for example, your thyroid, and you have high, antibodies for against your thyroid, but you have no symptoms and your thyroid's working perfectly fine. And that's a percentage of people. So you don't, sometimes people think, oh, I want to just go get screened for everything and just figure out if I have, any type of autoimmune condition. And it's not necessarily how it works. You don't necessarily want to do that because we all have some degree of this going on at all times. Just like I mentioned earlier, like with this police force analogy, like no police force is perfect. It's just when one goes way on the other side and starts to really go off the walls and become really corrupt, that's like, quote unquote corrupt. That's when things, we got to figure out what's wrong and try to, improve things. And when I say this, figure out what's wrong and try to improve things, there's a lot of people selling solutions, quote unquote solutions to autoimmune disease. And that's not how it works. Like if you see someone saying they have an answer to autoimmune disease overall or any specific autoimmune disease, they're probably lying. They're probably scamming you. Like to be
Yeah.
frank, like there is, you can't just give someone, like you take someone with, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, like you can't just put them on a diet and it's going to fix it, or give them a certain number of supplements and it's going to fix it. Some people have it because they have, too much iodine, and that iodine is causing their immune system to start like that iodine toxicity is causing, damage to the thyroid. Some people have it because, they have really low vitamin D levels and really low, you know, um, iron and magnesium levels, and their immune system's just a little bit more like tipped towards a more inflammatory response because of that. And so they need to address those things. And like everybody is different in the things that can be contributing to their specific autoimmune disease. And there's a lot of people online trying to sell protocols, and there's a really popular, it's called the Autoimmune Protocol that it's a book and a whole, business that was kind of built around that a lot of people followed thinking that it was going to be some cure for their disease. And it really, for a lot of people that I've worked with, it caused them to really go into a really, really restrictive diet and eventually worsen things because due to malnutrition. It's a really like, this autoimmune protocol is, you take away beans and whole grains and lots of different foods, seasonings and spices and nightshades and coffee, and you take away all these foods that, nuts and seeds, like generally are health promoting foods, that can be problematic in
In some kind.
certain specific cases. But generalizing, telling everyone that they need to take away these foods to improve their health condition, leads to making it really difficult to actually meet your nutritional needs. And so when people do this, when they say, hey, take away all these foods, a lot of times people with autoimmune conditions feel better because one of the things that really separates autoimmune disease from other diseases when it comes to nutrition is there are more food sensitivities. Like people with autoimmune conditions are more likely to have a sensitivity to gluten or to dairy or to not be able to digest beans well or to react to lectins or to have a nightshade sensitivity. Like these things do exist, and they're more common amongst individuals with autoimmune conditions. And that's where when people who have these diseases go on these really restrictive diets, they feel better because oftentimes they're avoiding some of these things that they were having a sensitivity reaction to, or an intolerance reaction to, and they feel better when they remove it. But they didn't need to go on this super restrictive diet. They needed to figure out what they were having an intolerance to, in removing that from the diet while building a health promoting dietary pattern as opposed to cutting out every single food. And
Yeah.
that kind of leads into something that you and I have talked about quite a bit, which is the carnivore diet.
Hey guys, some of you may not know that I'm the scientific advisor for a supplement company called Outwork Nutrition. I help with the formulation of new products to help ensure that they're effective and backed by science. Unlike many other supplement companies out there, we don't rely on exaggerated claims or flashy marketing tactics. Instead, we let the science speak for itself. We take pride in formulating products that deliver real results, helping you achieve your fitness goals in a meaningful way. If you're in the market for supplements like protein powder, pre-workout, or recovery products, make sure to check us out at outworknutrition.com. And as a thank you for being an avid listener of this podcast, use code Joey for an exclusive discount at checkout. You can find the link to our website down in the description of this podcast episode. Remember, our goal is to empower you with science-backed supplements that truly make a difference. Choose Outwork Nutrition and elevate your fitness to new heights.
Yeah. So I definitely want to go more in depth on the nutrition related stuff in terms of how it relates to autoimmune conditions and what can people do. But I really want to talk about one last topic because you mentioned, for example, you don't want to do a whole large screening for all sorts of antibodies because it's not going to be super accurate, and we all have a certain a certain amount of this going on in our bodies. So before we hop into the nutrition discussion, what are some good screening tools, right? Like if somebody thinks they may have a particular autoimmune condition, they're experiencing certain symptoms, what are some good screening tools to determine whether you do or don't have?
So this is so challenging, unfortunately, because the symptoms are, depending on the autoimmune condition, it's going to be different, and they're so vague. And this is where a lot of the marketing on social media and marketing in the health space kind of takes advantage of people with autoimmune conditions. Is oftentimes the symptoms are, things like dry eyes, fatigue, joint pain, and these things like can be a consequence of an unhealthy lifestyle. They can be the consequence of, poor eating habits, and they can be the consequence of some of these other things. So, that's why it can be challenging, is because sometimes these things just seem like the general consequence of an unhealthy lifestyle. When you can see oftentimes like some of the kind of early signs of someone who actually has like an autoimmune condition is you just have more of an inflammatory response, like in general, and you're experiencing like it, like with thyroid disease, you're just fatigued all the time, and it truly
Yeah.
is. When you talk to people, your experience, maybe they don't recognize it, but that your experience is different. When you go work out, you just don't recover. You're sore for 4 days. You can't even get out of bed the next day. You're exhausted because your immune system's already working, like your immune system's already overactive. And then you do a hard resistance training program, and your immune system has to go repair that tissue that you broke down, and you're just going to be wiped. Like people with autoimmune conditions tend to have a really hard time, like going into really high levels of intensity with resistance training, depending on how their condition is. Cause it's always like with autoimmune diseases, you can go into like more of a flare where your symptoms are increased. And then other times where you can be, asymptomatic, you have no symptoms at all. And most of the time people go through these oscillations between having a little bit more symptoms and a little bit less. And typically, that's where, training, if you're trying to train hard when you have a little bit more symptoms, you can completely wipe yourself out and actually make things worse in terms of like your condition, like take days to recover. You feel like crap. You feel sick all the time. You actually feel like sometimes you feel like you're sick and you're not. And you're like, okay, I feel like I've been sick for 4 days. I feel like I had a virus for 4 days kind of thing, a little bit fatigued, just off, brain fog, kind of unexplainable. Those things are so hard to figure out. So if you're noticing that you're experiencing those symptoms, I'm not a big fan of like normally saying go to Google, but I personally would recommend to keep a very detailed list of the types of symptoms that you're experiencing and try to do your own personal research on it. Because you're going to have to go first talk to a GP. If you're in the US, I mean, if you're outside of the US, probably the same thing. But you have to go talk to basically a primary care doctor first in order to like start taking steps towards getting diagnosed. And there's 80 different autoimmune conditions, and primary care doctors, when you go to them and say, hey, I'm fatigued, I'm tired, I have joint pain, like, they're not going to say, oh, you might have lupus. They're going to say, you probably need to lose some weight, or you probably need to sleep more, or you probably need to stress less, because those are the more obvious, more common solutions. And it's not anything against them. They just have 5 minutes with you or 10 minutes with you. And if they're going to, if someone's tired or they're fatigued and, they have joint pain, the first thing that I'm going to go to is not, you might have lupus or you might have mixed connective tissue disease or whatever the case may be, and so, and there's so many different autoimmune conditions, and you have such little time with your primary care doc that you have to really go in with some information. And so I would go to Google with your specific symptoms, keep a good list and say, okay, I'm and try to be mindful, but don't overdo it, because sometimes people can fall into a pattern of becoming hypochondriac with some of this stuff. And you start to notice, oh man, I'm really starting to experience these symptoms, and you start to think everything is like wrong with you. And so you don't want to kind of fall into that, but just try to be mindful. Like, okay, I'm truly experiencing some symptoms that seem off. I'm having pain in my shoulder that just doesn't go away, and I didn't even exercise. My knee hurts and it's swollen, and it has been for months, and I haven't exercised. Or I'm having fatigue that just doesn't go away. Can't sleep at night. I'm restless in the middle of the night. Some of those things, if they're occurring and they're different, and all of these symptoms kind of built up, and there's not a major change in your lifestyle, this can be a factor. Now, there's another really important thing that can also like have all these same symptoms, is hormonal issues. It's like hormonal issues can present with a lot of these same symptoms. And this is where that's where I say you really need to keep a good log and pay attention to things. Is it directly related to your hormonal changes in your cycle, or is it not? Is it more related to your, is it just more random? Is it more related to your lifestyle? Things like that. So, you have to, unfortunately, with these things, because there's so many, and because the way the healthcare system is set up, you don't actually sit down and talk with the actual healthcare provider. So I personally had, I got diagnosed with an autoimmune condition a couple of years ago, and I had to know what to ask for. Like, I was like, hey, can we test a couple of inflammatory markers? Because these are the symptoms I'm having. And I think, like, my whole life I've had, sometimes I have joint pain. One time I had this thing called, I had like an inflammatory ligament issue where I couldn't like move my thumb for like a couple of months. The thumb popped up. So like my thumb got really inflamed for like a couple of months, and I had to wear went to the doctor. It was called like de Quervain syndrome or something like that. And now that I look back, I'm like, oh, that was just like kind of that underlying inflammatory response that's kind of been going on in my body for quite a while, that I've always been aware of. Like, I've always recognized like little symptoms of it, but it wasn't until I really experienced, like, I had a virus and it didn't go away. Like, the fatigue didn't go away after that. And that's when I was like, okay, I really need to go get this tested. And that's how I like finally got diagnosed, after noticing some of these symptoms for quite some time. But it requires really detective work on your part,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And you're going to have to get a primary care doctor in most cases to run a couple of inflammatory markers. So like ANA, CRP, IL-6 sometimes. And then also, like, sometimes the primary care doctor can run some tests for thyroid function as well, and then get the proper referrals to like a rheumatologist if you have any type of like joint issues or any type of inflammatory conditions. Or if it's more hormonal, then going to OBGYN or an endocrinologist, getting to that right specialist that can actually run the right testing, and who's going to really understand that condition a lot better. Because everyone thinks, oh, it's a doctor, they know everything. As I just mentioned, there's 80 different autoimmune conditions. Like, for you to be able to come in and them to be able to think about those 80 different autoimmune conditions and everything else that could be possibly going on if you're working with a general practitioner is going to be really hard. And so you have to really kind of take some of your health into your own hands there, in terms of really figuring out what might be going on.
Yeah, dude. While you're sharing some of your symptoms, you're making me think whether I have something wrong with me.
So here's the thing. Like when I was younger, so like in my whole 20s, like I had back issues for a while, and I had like my hands would just hurt all the time, like just be in pain, and I always noticed that, like for early 20s, and I thought I had arthritis. Like I thought I had arthritis in my 20s, and when I got screened for recently, like, it was about 4 years ago, I thought it was gonna be like arthritis that came up positive, like because I was pretty sure of that, because that's the main thing. If I don't sleep well, if I'm not eating well, that's the first thing that I'll notice is like my hands start to get like tight and like inflamed. Like I can inflamed, quote unquote. I mean, it is an inflammatory response. I can feel
Yeah.
the swelling, and like I can't move them as well, and like I can feel that elsewhere, but hands is where like I can actually feel pain. Now, the other um area that I can notice it very, very obviously is just training hard. Like I could train my ass off in my 20s without an issue. And now, if I go really hard, I'll just be wiped out. Like if I go really hard, like multiple days in a row, especially if I'm not like sleeping really well, like it will completely wipe me out. Like for days. Like there's times like in the last 5 years, I've cut down my training like 50% probably in most cases. Unless like there are phases where I feel really good and I train really hard, but then there's other phases where I'm like, I know if I keep doing this, I'm gonna put myself out, and I need to just like pull it back because I'm not recovering as well. And it's what I mentioned, like these kind of flares of like I can feel symptoms. Like for me, it's drier eyes, hands hurt a little bit. I'll have pain in like my shoulder and back, and just like weird random pains throughout. And it's because for me, it's a connective tissue disease. So it's my immune system attacking all the connective tissue throughout my upper body, essentially. So like in my lungs and heart, and, connective tissue in my shoulders and all that. And so like I'm feeling those symptoms from that stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, it's important to be aware of it, but definitely don't get to the point where you're over concerned about it. It's, 10% of the population about. And the other thing with this is, because a lot of times people will come to me and they're like, "Oh, I got diagnosed with autoimmune disease," like, and they're really worried about it. And it's like, we all have certain ways that our body just works, doesn't work as well as other people in various ways, or works differently than other people in various ways. And getting diagnosed with an autoimmune condition doesn't mean like, oh, you're gonna be you're gonna spiral towards a terrible death. Now, some can be very bad, and some can be very, very harmful, and cause a lot of, loss of quality of life very quickly and things like that. But in most cases, it's just telling you that your immune system is a little bit more reactive for a variety of reasons. And oftentimes, you can really improve that with your lifestyle. So as I mentioned earlier, genetics and environment play a role. And lack of sleep is a really big one. Nutrition, too much exercise, it can be a factor. Too little exercise can be a factor. So if you don't exercise at all, that's going to negatively affect your immune system, because your immune system benefits from exercise. It improves our antioxidant capacity, and just reduces our exercises, like reduces our immune system's like inflammatory responses to various stimuli. But too much exercise leads to intestinal permeability, leads to immune dysfunction, dysregulation overall. And so I've worked with multiple clients with autoimmune conditions who they got there through an overstressful life. Like, and that's probably where I get there. Like just not sleeping enough, being a single parent, working, running a business, all that stuff. And sometimes that too much exercise can be a factor, stress from work, stress from relationships, all of that can be a factor because stress, these sources of stress can dysregulate our immune system, but also, as I mentioned earlier, that gut lining that can be broken down by non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs also gets broken down by exercise, also gets broken down by high levels of stress. And if you're under chronic stress and over exercising, or either one that just on a very high level, can really lead to negative effects there. And that like 60% of our immune system is in our gut. So that's the border patrol where our body is being protected, is largely in our gut. So if you break down that lining of your gut, then your immune system is going to be exposed to more what are called antigens that cause an immune response. So um it's not like, because we hear leaky gut on social media. I don't want people to take this too far. Like, this can occur to a certain degree, but it's not driving the entire condition. But some people, their autoimmune diseases are slightly being worsened by this GI dysfunction, or even slightly triggered by this GI dysfunction due to some of these other things that can contribute to this increased intestinal permeability.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, man. I think, because sometimes people have a hard time understanding, like, how do stress and sleep and exercise and diet, which all seem like completely different things, all influence the same thing, our immune system, right? I think what people don't understand is that our immune system's heavily involved in recovering from many of these different processes, right? Like, an immune response is important for recovering from exercise. It's also important from recovering from stress and sleep and all of these things. And so, like, all of these things are essentially activating your immune system. And if it's too much, it can, as you mentioned, dysregulate your immune system, right? Like, a lot of these things, although they are different, quote unquote, different variables, they all influence very similar pathways in many ways.
They add to our like overall bucket of stress.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be, it doesn't have to be, people think physical stress. It can be both of these things can both contribute to that same bucket and kind of lead to the immune dysregulation that contributes to autoimmune disease. And truly, like, that's what happens in most cases. It's stress from, like you mentioned, physical, like either too little physical activity, because physical inactivity is a stress, or too much physical activity, and then stress from environmental pollutants, or
Yeah.
breathing in certain things, stress from poor diet, stress from relationships, stress from poor sleep, stress from just emotional stress. You hate your job, you hate where you live, you are just mad all the time, you have a negative mindset, you're all of these things contribute to a bucket. And once that bucket gets overfilled, and this is kind of how I explain it to my clients, is exactly like this. How we talked about these flares, and how things can kind of, you experience more symptoms sometimes, and they call this like an autoimmune flare, and then the symptoms go down. Well, basically, when you fill up that bucket of stress, once that starts to overflow, that's when you get into a flare, and you have to like reduce the stress to get out of those symptoms. And I experienced this in my own life. Like, there's times where if I'm sleeping less, I'm training hard, because for me, my symptoms, I have like super dry eyes, and like I mentioned, the pain in my hands and stuff like that. That'll start to come on, and it won't go away. Like, once you change your symptoms, you're like, oh, it's gonna, or once you change, you're like, okay, I'm gonna sleep more, I'm gonna eat better, it's gonna go away. It takes like a bit of time for your body to like get back regulated again. And it's not the next day it feels better. It's like, okay, it takes 4 or 5 days. Once I feel those symptoms coming on, I'm like, okay, I need to chill out with my exercise, I need to sleep a little bit more. Takes several days for my body to kind of get back where I'm feeling like good again.
Yeah. You know what I've always found really interesting, and I mean, related to autoimmune conditions, as you were talking about emotional stress and stuff like that, but even just like general health, how much things like psychological stress and emotional well-being really impact our health. Because it's things that we can't see, right? Like nutrition, pretty simple, like healthy food, eat whole, minimally processed foods. These are healthy things. exercise. It's something we do. It's good for our body. But just like the importance of just like being happy overall, right? Be in a good mental state. It's like, I'm sure you've probably watched, and it's not the most scientific show, but just the Blue Zone show on Netflix. Have you seen that?
Mhm.
And just like how there's obviously commonalities amongst populations on Earth that are healthy. And one of them is just like they have a positive environment, right? And like they're really close to their family and their grandparents and their kids. And it's a happy environment. And people in general like their lifestyle and they live pretty simple lives. And like it's hard to really believe that those things are really important, but they are really important, right?
Yeah, I believe it because I've observed people who are older and healthier. Like I I don't know many people who are like super into health, like into nutrition and stuff like that. But some of the older people that I know that have lived a longer, healthier life generally just tend to be like happy people. Like from my experience, like it's people who are doing stuff that's still active in life, doing stuff that they enjoy, spending time with their families, still engaged in work, still, just engaged with certain things. Um, yeah, we understate the importance of it. And I have to really like with some of my clients, this is like largely what we talk about sometimes, not even like nutritional changes. And there have been some cases that I can think about where um, the stress came from the restrictive diet that they were trying to follow. And
Sure.
once we said, "Hey," like, once we got past that, because reintroducing foods is a stress in itself for someone who's been on a restrictive diet for a long time. Once we got past that reintroduction of foods and not being on a restrictive diet all the time and actually eating enough calories and not being constantly anxious about eating everything, like, the food intolerances like completely go away and symptoms start to improve. And sometimes it's people bring it on themselves with like the nutritional restrictions that seem like they're taking you in the right direction, but they're actually like just making your diet much more stressful. Like when you have to
Yeah.
cut out 9 different foods or 15 different foods, it's really hard to shop and feed yourself, especially if you have a family. Um, you know, and to do that, like, I can't tell you how many most people that I work with who have, like, autoimmune conditions and digestive issues who have, like, been trying to improve it for a while, they're usually on, like, stressed out with their nutrition or anxious with it because they've heard this is bad for them and this is bad for them, and they're trying to avoid these things, and they feel bad when they eat them, like, from a mental standpoint, and just really confused. Uh, like I mentioned earlier, with these autoimmune diseases, yes, there are food intolerances. Food intolerances are much more likely, and many people with autoimmune conditions do have at least one, sometimes several food intolerances. But um, it, you shouldn't go onto a hyper restrictive diet because of
Yeah.
that. You know, simplifying your diet. What I typically recommend is like just simplifying your diet, not going onto a really restrictive diet, but eating 3 or 4 different ingredients in each meal and then rotating that out and figuring out what it is that you're negatively reacting to so that you can either remove it or figure out why you're reacting to it in a negative way, because that helps to give more information about what's going on with you. If you notice that you're having a negative reaction to just legumes every time you eat them, then maybe that's just it. You just have to avoid those
Yeah.
and you're good, and you don't have to go on a carnivore diet or something like that to try to improve it. And you know this This is one of the reasons that carnivore diet is so popular, is because people with autoimmune conditions often feel significantly better when they follow a carnivore diet in the short term. Because in the short term, they're eliminating their food intolerances, and then they're taking away beyond food intolerances. And it depends on the autoimmune condition, and also depends, like, the research is, just kind of limited currently, but different food additives. So if you're eating a lot of processed foods, there's various food additives that have potentially been shown to, worsen certain autoimmune conditions. And, this can be a problem for some people. And going away from processed foods so that you can limit the amount of ingredients in your diet so that you don't have to worry about all these things that you might be reacting to, really helps like identify what it is that what it is that you truly are reacting to from like a whole foods perspective. And then, some people processed foods, just some of the additives like can really be a problem for some people.
Yeah, dude, we almost scheduled the podcast with this guy that was commenting on a post of mine about like carnivore diet. He was sharing his experience that he had certain autoimmune conditions, can't remember what it was, had a ton of issues with different foods, and then just went carnivore, and he's been feeling great, and he's been doing it for a couple of years. He's not a social media guy at all, just like a normal person. And I was the one commenting back and forth. Another friend of mine was commenting back and forth, and they hopped on a phone call to talk a little bit more about it. And then my friend reached out to me, was like, probably be a good idea to have a podcast episode with this guy just to pick his brain and see what his experience has been like for a couple of years, and then ask him if he's tried other foods. But like he declined. He didn't want to do the podcast, unfortunately.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I actually just mentioned that I want to do that. I want to get people on my podcast, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do it because I have a lot of other topic episodes that I want to do right now. And unless I add another episode per week, I'm not sure I'm going to do it. But just finding people who have completely reversed health conditions with various diets. And because it really comes down to two things. And I want to be able to, kind of describe that, because any improvement in health from nutrition comes down to two things. Like either you change the amount that you're eating or you change the quality of your nutrition. And when someone goes carnivore and they lose 60 pounds and reverse certain health conditions, they ate less and they improve the quality of their nutrition because, their beef is much more nutritious than the Pop-Tarts and Goldfish and McDonald's that they were eating before. And so in any of these cases, it's just we're eating less or eating the right amount of calories and improving the quality of your nutrition. And that's what we really need to be focusing on, instead of like, how do we follow this other crazy diet that someone else did?
Yeah.
It's like, how do we
What would you
go ahead?
What would you say in the context, Adrian, of people that go from like a vegan diet to like a carnivore diet and they see improvements there?
Because of what we just talked about, a
Yeah.
lot of the primary food intolerances and things that can trigger especially microbial responses. So like some people with autoimmune conditions, and data's not, so there is changes in the microbiome, but we can't measure the microbiome well right now. But in my opinion, from what I've seen, because the carnivore diet is essentially an antibiotic, you're taking away all of the fermentable fibers from the diet. And so the microbes in this person's gut is now going to, like, you're going to kill off those microbes. A lot of them, they're going to starve off. And that's going to change the composition of the microbiome. Some people have a microbiome that is not supporting their health and is actually triggering immune responses. And so when those people eat a vegetarian or vegan diet, they're eating a shit ton of FODMAPs. Like they're just eating a whole bunch of fermentable fibers that are feeding their microbiome, but their microbiome's not healthy. And so it's causing a worsening of their symptoms. And when they go carnivore, it shifts their microbiome, and that's what leads to the improvements in health, is because maybe they got exposed to E. coli or salmonella or whatever the case may be, but unfortunately, we can't measure these things very well right now because our ability to properly profile the microbiome is extremely limited. Like we rely right now on stool testing, which measures the microbes that come out in the stool, but like what comes out in your poop isn't a reflection of the 27 feet of intestinal tract and the various ecosystems that exist throughout the different environments in our gut.
So what would you say, and I want to get your perspective on this, because this is one of the main points that people in the carnivore community use to discourage people from eating plant-based foods, right? Like, look at all these people that have followed a vegan diet before, and now they follow carnivore and they feel better. There are all these things in plants that can cause reactions. So it's probably a good idea to avoid them overall. Like, What is your response to that sort of claim?
So those things in plants can cause a potential reaction in some people. There's also those things in animal foods. Like some people react that way to dairy. Some people react that way to fish. Some people react that way to shellfish. Some people react that way to various animal pork, So beef is less common in terms of allergic responses, but that happens as well. And so it's not just plant foods that have these different things that can cause immunological responses. Um, the thing with the plant foods, with people who typically when they go from vegan to like animal based, they just had underlying digestive issues and they weren't able to digest the fiber. And the fiber was probably, like I mentioned, kind of triggering a microbiome thing. And the guy Paul Saladino, the guy who started the carnivore diet, he says he went from vegan to carnivore. And if you listen to his story, he had digestive issues, and they improved when you take out all those fiber rich foods. The other thing is, all fiber is not beneficial in the same ways, and this is like we think about, we classify fiber all together, but there's insoluble fibers, there's soluble fibers, there's insoluble fibers that are, or there's soluble fibers that can become viscous, and some that don't. There's some that are fermented by our gut, some that are fermented by our gut microbiome, some fibers that aren't fermented by our gut microbiome. So we have these, there's some fibers that are called insoluble fibers that aren't fermented by our gut microbiome that essentially create these little like small particles in our gut, and they've been known to help with like if you have constipation, they can help stimulate bowel movements, but we now know that they do that through kind of irritating the lining of our gut. So if you have like an inflammatory bowel disease, if you have some digestive issues that are, where you have like a very irritated gut already, and you're eating a lot of plant foods that have a lot of insoluble fiber that is non-fermentable, that might worsen things. And so I only know all this stuff because I work with people with GI issues. Like, so I have to understand like the different fiber types and how they can affect different people in various ways, and these very unique circumstances. And I talk about all these things. This isn't the general population. Like, most people are perfectly fine eating these foods, and they don't cause an issue for you because the health of your gut is fine. And this, that fiber goes to your gut perfectly fine if you're a healthy person. But if you have if the mucosal line, so in our gut we have like this thick mucus layer essentially that protects our gut from irritation and damage. And so if that's broken down, then certain things that other people can tolerate perfectly fine are going to be more problematic for you. And so this is where, some people with health conditions who feel better when they start to follow different diets, they think that they found this, unique solution that everyone else needs to follow. And the reality is that they just oftentimes don't understand that they are the unique. They're unique. They're a unique person, and this has just worked for them. And not everyone needs to necessarily follow that. They just oftentimes don't understand the reasoning why these things work, or why it helped them to feel better. Like when it comes to Carnivore MD, like it's a very simple explanation. He's eating a lower FODMAP diet, and he cut out all insoluble fibers, and he had underlying digestive issues. Like, that's going to improve your gut if you have these underlying IBS or inflammatory bowel disease type symptoms.
Yeah. He's not carnivore anymore, by the way.
Yeah, well, so what he's following is what would be considered a Crohn's disease exclusion diet. Like, if you look at his dietary pattern and if you look up Crohn's disease exclusion diet, it's pretty much the same thing. And so he's like
fruit, meat, honey, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's if you look up Crohn's disease exclusion diet, like that's what it is. It's low in insoluble fiber, because these insoluble fibers can irritate the lining of the digestive tract for people with, irritable or inflammatory bowel disease.
Yeah. Dude, what is the relationship to, there's so many different topics to cover here, and I know we've been talking a lot about the nutrition stuff. And I have a couple final nutrition related questions that I want to ask, but in general, what is the relationship between the autoimmune diseases and diet, right? Because we're talking about it as if, I know there are certain autoimmune conditions that attack the gut more than others. Are there other autoimmune conditions that don't have anything to do with the gut, and are those influenced by diet as well, or not really?
Yeah. So it just depends on the person. So sometimes diet plays no role at all. Like, there are some people who they just had the unlucky lottery of they have a genetic predisposition and they got exposed to a virus or something, and their immune system just went completely out of whack, and all of the dietary changes in the world aren't going to improve things. Now, from the other side, diet, what we eat, people listen to this know this, like, probably one of the most important things for our health overall, like, what we eat is what provides the nutrients that help to support our immune system, that help to, give us everything that our body needs to function. So, if you are eating a poor diet and you are experiencing deficiencies in various nutrients that your immune system needs to be able to function properly, particularly, I mentioned a couple of them earlier, like zinc, vitamin A, vitamin D. If you're low on any of those because you're eating a diet that isn't, providing enough of those things, then over time that can lead to a dysregulation of your immune system because it doesn't have what it needs to properly regulate itself. So the immune system, essentially, we want it. So, like, the way it's attacking our tissues in an autoimmune disease, like, sounds bad, but we want that to occur. It's just like with the police force. We want it to be able to attack things. And so, but we also, we want there to be a good training in place so that it's attacking the right things. And that training is, having the right nutrients and having the right exposures and not overexposing our body to too many different antigens and too many different stressors so that, that leads to kind of that imbalance that I mentioned earlier.
And when it does come down to diet, I know it depends on the person, right? But what are some of the main foods that perhaps people should look at first when determining whether or not they have sensitivities to certain foods that are causing flare-ups?
So, unless you like notice a very distinct response to something when you eat foods, like say when you eat pasta, you have serious GI issues or you just have serious brain, like it's just obvious, I wouldn't go to removing foods first. I would first focus on building a healthy dietary pattern. So, like, getting to a good pattern of healthy eating first, and then if you're not feeling better, moving in the right direction the way that you want to be, then start to explore different food sensitivities. The thing that I would look up is there's the top 8 allergens. So the top 8 foods that can contribute to allergies, and these are the main things that can contribute to intolerances as well. So this is, gluten, dairy, soy, various types of nuts like cashews. I think sesame seeds is on that list now. And so if you look up those are the primary, like, most likely things that can be contributing to some of these responses. For a lot of people, gluten is the main one. Like, in with people with autoimmune disease, it's about 1 in 5-ish that have a gluten intolerance, gluten sensitivity. And that doesn't mean that you have to completely avoid it. It's just there's a lot of people, average person, eating a normal standard American diet. They're eating gluten in every meal, along with a bunch of other stuff, just not nutritious things. And so, oftentimes it's not necessarily that, if you have an intolerance to it, you have to avoid this forever. It's like, you shouldn't eat that at every meal, probably. Like, it's something that we need to just reduce the consumption of overall. And so, gluten, dairy's, again, another common one. Soy is another common one. But then, outside of that, FODMAPs. For a lot of people with autoimmune conditions, they also have digestive issues. Sometimes the digestive issues are the reason that they developed autoimmune disease, or partly the reason they developed autoimmune disease. And FODMAPs can be a problem. So this stands for fermentable oligo. I'm not going to describe that. People are going to want to listen to it. But basically, it's fermentable carbohydrates. So if you're looking at like fiber-rich foods, beans and nuts and seeds and whole grains and vegetables, these are all going to be rich in FODMAPs, and these FODMAPs these are prebiotic fibers. They provide fuel for our gut microbiome. Great things. Like, I eat lots of them. I recommend most people eating lots of them. We want to eat lots of fiber-rich foods that have a lot of FODMAPs, that have a lot of these prebiotic fibers. But people with autoimmune conditions have a high likelihood of having a response to these, where, when they eat more of these, they have digestive symptoms. They have inflammatory responses. They have negative responses to them overall. And it's for some of the reasons that I talked about earlier. Sometimes there's a microbiome, dysfunctional microbiome that's contributing to inflammation, that when we eat more FODMAPs, it's actually worsening things. And as you can tell by anyone listening to this stuff is complicated as heck. Like, when you hear people talk about this stuff on social media, I get so frustrated.
Yeah.
There's so much misinformation about it. And like, I've mostly been working with clients with digestive and autoimmune conditions for like 5 years. And I've read almost every paper that I can on this topic. I mean, I probably read almost every nutrition paper in nutrition and autoimmune diseases, like the main ones that I worked with, like lupus and Hashimoto's and arthritis and all that. And like, it's super complicated. There's no simple answers. Like everybody's different. What improves symptoms for each person is different. I've worked with people who do really well on a more plant-based diet and people who do really well on a more, quote unquote animal-based diet. And like, they have the same condition, but eating completely opposite diets and both feel great. And it's like, that's just how it works sometimes because of, the way that these things, the underlying way that these things develop. It's like kind of genetics can be completely different in the development of these things.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important to understand, probably one of the things that contributes to that is that, listen, I'm not well versed in autoimmune disease like you, so I might be saying something incorrect here. So correct me if I'm wrong. But many of these autoimmune diseases are characterized by particular symptoms, perhaps, right? And these symptoms can be caused by different things. So two people might have similar symptoms, aka say same autoimmune condition, but being triggered by different stimulus, right? So where some person gets triggered by a particular plant-based food and they do better on an animal-based food diet, somebody might have the complete opposite experience. And although it is on paper the same condition, the etiology or the cause is slightly different, perhaps, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's with these food intolerances, that really is where things just differ so much. Is
Yeah.
The food intolerances are highly individualized, and they can be digestive reactions. They can be systemic reactions where you're feeling like brain fog, fatigue, and sometimes that can be really difficult to kind of dial in.
Yeah.
And that's where I understand why some people go on these really restrictive diets, is because it's just easier to just say, I'm just going to eat beef for forever, and I feel better. And I've like you mentioned a second ago, I've had many conversations of people who have gone on these really restrictive diets and felt a lot better. But I always am concerned with the long-term, consequences of that, because you are experiencing malnutrition to a certain degree. And in almost every case, when people are on these these carnivore diets, like almost everyone has very, very high levels of LDL cholesterol, which, over the course of a lifetime is probably not going to be a good, good place to be. We have seen already some of these carnivore influencers who are otherwise in really healthy shape, exercise all the time. And some of them have actually like had cardiovascular events, like had heart attacks and things like that, because you don't see heart disease occur. You can be perfectly, in great shape, and but if you're developing plaque in your arteries because you have a whole bunch of cholesterol floating around in your blood, it's not going to be an ideal circumstance.
Yeah, for those of you guys listening that want perhaps a little bit more in detail explanation of like what our thing is with the carnivore diet, check out our carnivore diet episode. We have one together. You can just search Dr. Adrian Chavez carnivore diet on this podcast. You'll probably find it pretty easily. And I think we also did one specifically talking about like glycemic regulation as well as like cardiovascular biomarkers, right? Like LDL and all that stuff. I think that was probably the one right before that.
Yeah.
We've covered some really, really good topics for sure. So maybe this will boost engagement. People listening to this one will go check out the other ones. I'm piggybacking off of Adrian's expertise here. But all jokes aside, I know you wanted to talk about this topic. Before that, I wanted to mention something. So since you mentioned you're not going to say what FODMAPs are, for those of you guys listening that want to know what they are, just FODMAP, okay? And you can Google them and get a whole list of the foods. And one thing I've noticed sometimes with clients that do have sensitivities to some FODMAP containing foods, sometimes those sensitivities, if they're not very severe, are almost non-existent if they just cook down the foods significantly, right? So like, hey, I don't feel really good when I eat a ton of raw broccoli, but if I bake it and make it pretty soft and mushy, it's not as bad, right? And so some of those things can help too, because as you mentioned, like these are health promoting foods. If you can find ways to include them in your diet that perhaps don't cause symptoms as bad as like in other fashions, or again, like we mentioned, like quantity is so important, right? Like if you can include them in your diet just in smaller quantities and you don't have the same symptoms, that's probably a good way to move forward. And you mentioned something interesting earlier that I wanted to ask you. You said, the first thing you recommend is not eliminating foods, but it's to develop an overall healthy diet, because sometimes you don't even need to eliminate things. You need to improve your overall dietary patterns. It sounded like that was the case for you, right? Because you haven't mentioned, like, you don't exclude any particular food, but you mentioned you had a pretty poor diet before and improving your diet helped, right?
Yeah, definitely. It was an improvement in overall diet quality. I went in terms of like I didn't eliminate. I kind of did. Like I didn't eat any processed food. Like I was like did not eat anything that I didn't cook for the most part. Or sometimes I would go out to eat and like sometimes I would veer away from like my very very regimented diet. But for the most part, I was cooking everything from scratch, and I definitely took that approach though, like, and this is an approach that I often recommend with clients, like just maximizing nutrition. Like I was trying to get as much nutrition as possible from my diet and like trying to like optimize nutrition. And that's um kind of the approach that sometimes I take with clients with autoimmune conditions, because sometimes that can help break that inflammatory, like you have an ongoing systemic inflammatory response, and we can get a lot of anti-inflammatory nutrients from our diet. And so like really, and this is where some of these diets like the autoimmune paleo protocol, like they do emphasize very nutrient rich foods, and that's a good thing. Like when I work with clients, we're like, let's try like to absolutely maximize the nutritional value of your diet and see how much of a benefit can come from that. Maybe it's not worth the effort. Like sometimes it's probably too much effort to really like be worth it. But for some people, like it takes their symptoms down enough to be like, okay, I'm cool with like living this lifestyle if I can
Feel
feel
better.
this way. Yeah. So like everyone's different, but definitely like really emphasizing that nutritional density of the diet and ensuring that you're maximizing nutrient density with your foods. And that's where, sometimes, some of these foods, it's okay to exclude certain things. I'm not one to like demonize processed foods or things like that, but if you're trying to improve your health and you're experiencing, symptoms that are disrupting your life, and your goal is to, hopefully get those symptoms in better, better regulated, sometimes taking these more extreme measures and following a little bit more of a restrictive diet, it makes sense. The cost benefit is there, and so, some of my clients, they end up being on a more restrictive diet than I would recommend for the general population, but they're
It worked.
yeah, they're managing a health condition, with limited medication, and they feel great. Like it's worth
Which is the most important
yeah.
thing, yeah. I was laughing because when you said there are a lot of anti-inflammatory components in food and stuff, for some reason, the first thing that came to mind was like, do you remember, it was probably over like 10 years ago now, when like acai bowls became very popular?
Yeah.
Like, acai, like the best superfood ever, the most antioxidant rich, anti-inflammatory rich food. It's so funny how like even foods get like marketing behind them. And it's just like, it's just a food.
Acai bowls are still popular. Like if you
Yeah,
go
yeah.
into,
No,
like
but like when they first became really popular, like all the hype behind acai was hilarious. It's like, any sort of like dark berry, all sorts of like plant-based foods are gonna be really uh, anti-inflammatory, rich foods, right? So I just find it funny when like there's marketing around one food as like, this is the
this
one
yeah, the
super fancy,
superfood.
blah blah blah. It's like,
That
come
was
on,
back in the more plant-based era.
yeah,
Like a lot of the more popular nutrition stuff was more plant-based. Now we've shifted to like
yeah,
the more
yeah,
animal-based. Like 10 years from now, we're gonna be talking about, oh, remember back when there was the animal-based movement
yeah.
again, because it's gonna shift back over a bit.
Dude, I recently I made a video talking about how all diets, if they result in weight loss, it's due to creating an energy deficit. And I was talking about like carnivore and this and that. And there's this page that's becoming a little bit more popular recently. The guy's name's like Carnivore JT or something like
Oh, I
that.
know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So he reacted to that video in the part where I said like carnivore diet. You only eat meat Meat's satiating. You likely reduce your caloric intake. You lose weight. He cut that little part and he reacted. He's like, so tell me how I lost weight on a carnivore diet, eating 8,000 calories per day. And immediately I was like, dude, you were just not eating 8,000 calories per day. And if you were, like, I can't explain that. But do you know how much 8,000 calories of meat is, dude? It's a lot of meat, bro. And sticks of butter. Like, there's no way you ate 8,000 calories. Maybe a day, but like consistently for periods of time. Because he was like, I ate 8,000 calories a day on a carnivore diet and lost X amount of weight. I think it was like 20 or 30 pounds. I was like, first off, 20 or 30 pounds to lose that would require a couple of months. You don't lose that in a week, right? It would require, on the low end, at least 6 months or so. And you did that eating 8,000 calories every day. Like, nah, the math is just not mathing on there.
Yeah, another important thing is, especially, and this goes with autoimmune conditions, is like you really got to be careful of like people's anecdotes and people's stories. There's so many. There's most of the best-selling books on autoimmune conditions are people who changed their diet and they started eating a restrictive diet and they felt better, and so they wrote it as like, this is the answer. There's a book called The Autoimmune Protocol, I think is what it's called. It's like the most popular one in terms of in this space, and that's what they all are. And that they sometimes will put a scientific explanation to them, but it's not actually based on human studies. Like they will put an explanation to it based in that they'll extrapolate like cell studies and they'll say, oh, well, lectins are bad for you because they can do this to this cell. They can cause this type of immune response in a cell. And that's not what happens in our body. And many people have read these books and have gone on very restrictive diets as a result. And you just have to be really careful. Like there's not going to be a solution that someone else is giving to you. And if it's what they did, like definitely, that's definitely not what you like. We should never be taking advice from people who are trying to tell us to follow the diet that they started following. Like that's not how nutrition works. You are not me. Just like this whole episode, like we're talking about autoimmune conditions. Almost nothing actually applies to the general population. Like there's the completely different nutritional guidelines, approach, everything in terms of in someone who has this condition is who may have changed their diet and felt better is trying to give advice to the general population about how they should be eating oftentimes. And this is where, the signals get mixed, and we really have to understand that we're just all different. And, what our nutritional needs are not going to be what someone else's are. And we trying to follow someone else's diet or following a diet that someone else is prescribing to you or saying that is going to be a solution to your health conditions is usually not going to take you down a good path.
Awesome, man. Well, is there anything else you wanted to discuss related to autoimmune conditions, diet, or do you think we covered pretty much most of the topic?
I think we did a pretty comprehensive job overall of the topic.
Awesome, man. Well, do you mind sharing where people can connect with you further?
Yeah, so my podcast is a great spot. So a podcast called the Nutrition Science Podcast. You can find that pretty much anywhere if you type in the Nutrition Science Podcast, or if you just type in my
top
name.
50 now, right?
So I was like number 2 in Canada last time I checked.
Dude,
Yeah.
congrats.
Yeah, I stay like almost top 10 in Canada and like mostly like top 25-ish in the US right now. So the podcast has been doing really well. I try to cover, so the way that my podcast works is I like focus on one specific topic each episode and try to make it into like an archive of nutrition information. And so I highly recommend checking that out. I also have Instagram, pretty active there as well. So you can find me at Dr. Adrian Chavez. And if you just type in Dr. Adrian Chavez on Google, you'll find website, podcast, all of that stuff.
And those links will be in the description. And please share also your nutrition course.
Oh, yeah. So I have a course called the Nutrition Mastery Blueprint. It kind of goes over like what we discussed in terms of like meeting your nutritional needs. So I really focus on, that side of things when it comes to nutrition. What's really important is making sure that we're getting what our body needs. Like all of our bodies need certain things. Our bodies need calories and macronutrients and micronutrients. And if we understand what our bodies need, we can figure out how to kind of build a diet that works for us, that isn't copying someone else, because at the end of the day, that's never going to be sustainable. So yeah, I have a course. It's called Nutrition Master Blueprint. It goes over all that, and it just goes into detail about, everything that we need to really know to kind of build our own, healthy nutritional pattern. So you can find that directly on my website. You can find it on the front page, and if you click on like the link on the very front page, you'll be able to find more information about that.
Great. And as always, guys, all of those links will be down in the description of the episode. For those of you guys that made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you for supporting the podcast. And all I ask is that you take a second to rate the podcast and leave a review. It helps us a ton. We'll catch you in next week's episode.